Hi students, in last class we discussed epiglottis and mechanism of respiration, the diaphragm diagram and explanation, lungs, how the lungs taking oxygens, they cannot take oxygen directly, they have to depend on the diaphragm and the chest wall. And we also discussed gases exchanged alveoli, capillaries and alveoli. That is the most important both are. In today's class, we are going to explain about transportation of gases. In last class also I give a simple explanation about transportation of gases. But I will clearly we will discuss today transportation of gases. We know very well air is a mixture of gases. It's contain nitrogen, it's contain oxygen, it's contain carbon dioxide, other some gases, argons, 78% of nitrogen, 21% of oxygen, 0.03% of carbon dioxide, and 1% argons, other gas also mixed into the air, very small quantities. But air is a mixture of gases. When we breathe, only oxygen is not entering into the lungs, including oxygen. Carbon dioxide also is going, nitrogen also entering into the lungs, but they are not utilizing in the cellular respiration. Oxygen only utilizing. When cellular respiration takes place, the more carbon dioxide is releasing. So that's why in inhalation process, 21% of carbon dioxide is present, 0.03% of 21% of oxygen is present, 0.03% of carbon dioxide is present. In exhalation process, oxygen has reduced. 16% of oxygen in exhalation process, 4.4% of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide percent has increased in exhalation process, but the nitrogen always remains. We cannot take directly nitrogen. Even plants also cannot take nitrogen directly. The rhizobium bacteria convert the nitrogen to the plants, to the nitrogen to the nitrates. Then plants can absorb. So we can't take nitrogen directly, but we take from the food materials. From the food material, the nitrogen is entering in our body. The transportation of gases. So, we discussed in last class, in the alveoli, by the diffusion process, the oxygen, high concentration of oxygen from the alveoli and entering into the blood, mixed with the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is going to combine with the oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. So, in last class we discussed about this diagram. So, this is about alveoli and the blood capillaries. So, when we breathe through the nostril nasal cavity, pharynx, trachea, bronchus, bronchioles, alveoli. So high concentration of oxygen is present in the alveoli. By the process of diffusion, it will diffuses into the blood capillaries. In the blood capillaries, blood is there. So in the blood, hemoglobin is there. This oxygen is going to combine. So this oxygen is going to combine with the hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin happens in our lungs. So when it's combined with the oxyhemoglobin, these oxygens carried by the blood toward the tissues and then cell. What happens when this oxyhemoglobin enters into the cell? Again, this oxyhemoglobin will be divided. So oxyhemoglobin, what happens again? It's breakdown, it's divided, and to form hemoglobin plus oxygen. When this oxyhemoglobin carrying this oxygen toward the cell, when it enters into the cell, this oxyhemoglobin and oxygen will be divided. This oxygen will supply to the cell for the cellular respiration to break down of glucose. When breakdown of glucose happens, oxygen is utilized, carbon dioxide is produced. Again this carbon dioxide is combined with the hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is combined with the hemoglobin. Again this hemoglobin will carry carbon dioxide again where the alveoli is present. More carbon dioxide is present in the blood, less concentration of carbon dioxide present in the alveoli. By the process of diffusion, it will diffuses into the alveoli. Some amount of carbon dioxide will mix with the blood plasma. Some carbon dioxide will be mixed with the hemoglobin to send outside the body. This is the transportation of gases. How this oxygen is combined with the hemoglobin, how this carbon dioxide is going to combine with the hemoglobin. So now we'll discuss about while some people are carrying mountains, some people are going in waters, in oceans like seas. Have you observed they will carry some materials behind? So behind their backs, what is that? Oxygen cylinder. They will carry oxygen cylinder while they are climbing the mountains when they are going deep into the seas. Why? What is the reason? Because this oxygen level is always about sea level. Oxygen level. The concentration of oxygen is about the sea level. So what happens when we are climbing, when we are going up, the oxygen concentration will be decreased. Oxygen concentrations will be decreased when we are climbing the mountains. For example, around above the sea level of 13 kilometers or 8 miles. 8 miles. What happens? From the sea level at the height of the 13 kilometers or 8 miles, this oxygen level 1/5% only. It's not in good concentration in about 13 kilometers high. So that's why what happens if less oxygen is present on the mountain, when we are breathing, the 21% of oxygen cannot enter into the lungs. If the less amount of oxygen enter into the lungs, what happens? So the hemoglobin oxygen percentage will be decreased to combine with the hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. It will combine, but the less concentration of oxygen enter into the lungs. If less concentration of oxygen is entering the cell, what happens? The cellular respiration process will be decreased. The more energy will be not released, because for the cellular respiration, the sufficient oxygen should be there. If the sufficient oxygen is not there, the sufficient cellular respiration will not take place, and the sufficient energy will be not released. So respiration process will not take place properly. That's why they will carry oxygen cylinder when they are climbing. So in modern aircraft also, the aircraft aeroplane also flying very high. So around 13 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 10 above kilometers. But in modern aircraft, there is a sufficient oxygen is there inside the aircraft. So that's why they will not suffocated because sufficient oxygen they are providing. So this is about, so oxygen concentration is very important. In last class also I said the oxygen saturation should be 96 to 100. 96 to 100. So if it is decreasing, we will suffocate, we will affected with the breathing problem. So we will not breathe properly. When oxygen is not supplied properly, the energy will be not released. If the energy is not released, we can't talk, we can't walk. There are so many problems. It will affect it on the entire body. This is the problem of oxygen. Next we have discussed gases exchanged, tissue levels already we have discussed. Next studied gases exchanged, tissue levels. When oxygen is combined with oxygen, hemoglobin to carry the tissues. In the tissues, this oxygen and hemoglobin will be divided, separated. This oxygen will enter into the cell for the cellular respirations. While this hemoglobin coming back, it will carry the carbon dioxide. So it's simple. Next one is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration. Cellular respiration. We know already about the cellular respirations. Cellular respiration takes place in the cell using oxygen for cellular respiration, using oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water, and release energy for the life processes. We already discussed it, steps and events in respiration. So this cellular respiration takes place in two types. One is in the presence of oxygen. How the cellular respiration takes place? In the absence of oxygen. If the presence of oxygen is there, that is called as aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration. If respiration takes place in the presence of air, in the presence of oxygen, is called as aerobic respiration. If the respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen, is called as anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration. It is also called as fermentation. Fermentations. If the presence of oxygen is called as aerobic respiration. Aerobic. Its name only is the aerobic. Anaerobic. Absence of air. Absence of oxygen is called as aerobic respiration. Also called as fermentations. There are two types of organisms. One is prokaryotic and the second one is eukaryotic. Prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Cellular respiration in prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic is nothing but they do not have nucleus in their cell. Eukaryotic is nothing but they have nucleus in their cell. That is a simple difference. I think you already discussed in last 9th class also. Which one have nucleus is called as eukaryotic, which one do not have nucleus is called as prokaryotic. Cellular respiration takes place in prokaryotic cell like bacteria. In the cytoplasma. Cellular respiration in prokaryotic cell like bacteria. So the cellular respiration takes place in cytoplasma. Cellular respiration in eukaryotic cell takes place in cytoplasma and mitochondria. The best example of eukaryotic cell, plants and animals, bacteria. So this is about cellular respiration. Where cellular respiration takes place in prokaryotic cell, where cellular respiration takes place in eukaryotic cell. In prokaryotic cell, cytoplasma. In eukaryotic cell, cytoplasma and one more extra, that is mitochondria. So that's why the mitochondria is called as powerhouses of the cell. Powerhouses of the cell because it stores energy. In 9th class also we discussed about this diagram of mitochondria. Once again we will simply discuss about this mitochondria. Outer membrane, inner membrane, crystal, matrix. Ninth class we discussed deeply about this mitochondria. So it's a cylindrical, round or oval shape, 2 to 8 micron long, 0.5 micron wide. So it's made up of with double membrane, walls. So the inner fold protrudes is called as cristae. The space between the two cristae is called as matrix. It will have outer membrane and inner membrane. So it is also cellular respiration takes place in mitochondria. So here we will discuss about. So this mitochondria is also called as powerhouses of the cell. So the energy is stored in ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So the energy is stored in ATP, mitochondria, in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate is nothing but 3 phosphates. ADP is called as adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it is also called as an currency of energy. Currency cell. It's storing the cell. It's storing the energy. That's what it is called as currency of cell. Currency energy. So this ATP contains around 1 ATP. 7,200 calories of energy will store. 1 ATP contains 7,200 of calorie of energy stored in 1 ATP. What happens when the energy is required? The stored energy ATP will break down. The ATP will be break down. The stored energy will be released. This ATP is called as currency of the cell. this is about the simple explanation of the mitochondria. Aerobic respiration, anaerobic respirations. So respiration takes place in prokaryotic cell in the cytoplasma, eukaryotic cells in the cytoplasma and the mitochondria. So next we will discuss about when cellular respiration takes place, how the glucose is going to break down. What happens when the glucose is going to break down? In aerobic respirations, what is the end product? In aerobic respiration, what is the end product? It is called as glycolysis. 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 What is glycolysis? How the glucose is going to break down to form pyruvates. Pyruvates. See, this is the glucose is going to break down to form 3 pyruvates and release energy. In higher classes, we will discuss about this pyruvates. Its a reaction takes place in the glucose. So glycolysis. What happens when the glucose is break down to form pyruvates? How the glucose is going to break down? In the presence of oxygen or in the absence of oxygen? Absence of oxygen. Absence of oxygen is called as what? Anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration. It is also called as fermentation. Fermentation. The best example is bacteria and yeast. Lactic acid plus energy. Here ethanol, carbon dioxide, energy. Aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration. Example, plants and animals. Plants and animals. What happens? See, when glucose is break down in the cell, the glucose is break down in the cell, in the presence of oxygen, it is called as aerobic respiration. Aerobic respirations. When glucose is break down in cell, in the process of aerobic respiration, in plants and animals, what happens? Carbon dioxide is released, water is released, more energy is released. In aerobic respirations. What happens in anaerobic respirations? Low amount of oxygen or absence of oxygen in anaerobic respirations. When glucose is break down in bacteria, in the absence of oxygen, lactic acid will release, small amount of energy is released. When glucose is break down in the absence of oxygen in the yeast, ethanol will release, carbon dioxide will release, energy will be small amounts of energy will be released. This is the differences between the aerobic answer. 2 marks question. Very, very important. Pathway of cellular respiration. When the glucose is break down, how the steps will occur or events. Aerobic respiration, anaerobic respirations. In yeast, ethanol, carbon dioxide energy is released. Bacteria, lactic acid and energy will be released. We will discuss about this lactic acid. So next one is, can energy will be released without oxygen? We will discuss like this only. Can energy will be released without oxygen? The question is without oxygen. Yes or no? Can energy will be released without oxygen? See what happens when glucose, how the energy is released? Breakdown of glucose. Breaking down of glucose. In aerobic respiration, what is aerobic respiration? In the presence of oxygen. In the presence of oxygen, when glucose is break down, carbon dioxide, water and energy is released. In the absence of oxygen, when glucose is break down, lactic acid energy is released. Ethanol, carbon dioxide energy is released. Here also energy is released, but little small amount of energy is released in the absence of oxygen. But lactic acid is released here. So what happens? The best example is, while we are doing vigorous exercise, while we are doing running, while doing walking, while cycling, bicycles, while we are pedaling the bicycles. So treadmills, there are so many instruments which are nowadays. After doing exercise, what happens? So if you are going first day for running, so there are so many muscle pains. So what happens? When sufficient oxygen is not supplying to the body, instead of aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration will take place. Listen carefully. Suddenly you are running 2 or 3 kilometers. So what happens? So we will difficulty to breathe. So what happens? Our muscles pains will start it. Instead of aerobic, when we are running, we need more energy. So to release more energy, we need more percentage of oxygen. The supply of oxygen should be more. When we are getting less amount of oxygen supplying to the body, instead of aerobic respiration in our body, anaerobic respiration will take place. If anaerobic respiration takes place, instead of releasing more energy, what happens? Less energy and lactic acid will be released. So the body pains will take place in our body due to the accumulation of lactic acid. Accumulation of lactic acid in our body muscles. Everybody will get pains after running, after doing some exercise, because of accumulation of lactic acid in the muscles causes pains. Muscle causes pains. What happens when sufficient oxygen is supplied to the body? When anaerobic respiration again will be converted into aerobic respirations. If the sufficient oxygen is supplied to the every cell, when this lactic acid is eliminated from the body or removed from the body, we get more energy, then we will get normals. So this muscle stress will be gone from the body. This is about the reason of accumulation of lactic acid in the body. What happens when we are doing vigorous exercise? So there is a oxygen debt. Oxygen debt. What is oxygen debt? The low amount of oxygen is supplied to the body for the cellular respiration. If the low amount of oxygen is supplied, instead of aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration takes place. If anaerobic respiration takes place, again lactic acid is released. accumulation of lactic acid causes muscle space in our body. That's why while these trained athletes, while they are doing running, they can't breathe until they reach the race. They will hold their breathings. They will hold their breathing. The trained people only. So that's why they will run very fastly. So they train peoples. So this is about, can energy be released without oxygen? No, but instead of releasing energy, lactic acid is released in our body. Small amount of energy is released. That is nothing but instead of releasing energy, the lactic acid will be released in our body. So this is about today's lessons. Today homework. So pathway of cellular respiration. So write what is cellular respiration. I explain that. Aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration. Where cellular respiration takes place in eukaryotic cell, where cellular respiration takes place in prokaryotic cell, and the mitochondria diagram. Few words about mitochondria, ATP, and the last one is this diagram. This flow chart is the most important. So page number 34, you have to draw this glycolysis. You have to draw this glycolysis. Glucose, 3 carbon compounds. Pyruvates, 3 carbon compounds. Absence of oxygen. Aerobic respiration. Example of bacteria, yeast, and plants and animals.